Here are 6 of the craziest conspiracies ever shared on the Joe Rogan Experience. In episode 1117, Special Forces veteran Tim Kennedy revealed a story history insists is over. The official line, Hitler died in the bunker, but the documents tell another tale. FBI files, millions of dollars spent, agents chasing whispers across continents. What emerges is not folklore, but a manhunt that never truly ended.
When people first hear about the show I worked on, Hunting Hitler, they usually laugh. They say the title sounds absurd. They say it's ridiculous. Hitler died in the bunker in 1945. The story has been told 1,000 times, and the book is closed. But the deeper I went into the work, the more the so-called closed book began to fall apart. Over the past 2 decades, multiple governments have declassified thousands of documents. The Israelis, the British, the Germans, and especially the Americans. And what those files revealed was not the neat ending we were all taught in school, but something much more complicated and far more unsettling. Among those documents were FBI records that showed, beyond any doubt, that the United States spent millions of dollars searching for Adolf Hitler after the war had supposedly ended. These weren't symbolic searches or half-hearted gestures. These were active, expensive missions ordered by J. Edgar Hoover himself, with agents sent across South America, North Africa, the Canary Islands, and Spain following leads, chasing informant reports, tracking sightings. That's not something you do for a ghost story. Governments don't pour millions into a hunt unless there's at least the possibility that the man is still out there. The official story is clean, almost too clean. Hitler and Eva Braun in the bunker, marriage, cyanide, a gunshot, bodies burned. The Soviets arriving to recover the remains, and history turning the page. But when you examine it closely, the evidence doesn't hold. The Soviets claimed to have Hitler's skull, a fragment with a bullet hole, which they kept hidden in Moscow for decades. For years, the world had to take their word for it. Finally, when a genetic test was allowed, the results came back not as a man in his 50s, but as a woman in her mid-30s. That skull, paraded as Hitler's for 70 years, wasn't his. That doesn't prove where Hitler went, but it shatters the confidence of the story we've repeated for generations. If the remains aren't what they were claimed to be, then what do we actually know for certain? To understand why this question remains open, you have to imagine Berlin in April of 1945. It was the end of the world. The city was rubble. Allied bombs tore it apart from above. Artillery shells pounded it from every direction. And the Red Army was pushing in, street by street, house by house. They were short on rifles, so short that soldiers were told to pick up the weapon of the man who fell in front of them. The chaos was unimaginable. It was fire and smoke, bodies and debris, fear and collapse. And in that chaos, you want a clear forensic record? You want a tidy crime scene? That was impossible. There were no sealed bags of evidence, no careful forensic teams, no chain of custody. There was only the madness of war. Could Hitler have died in that bunker? Of course. But could the circumstances also have provided the perfect cover for an escape? Yes, and that possibility cannot be dismissed so easily, because here's the thing, many high-ranking Nazis did escape. That is not theory. That is documented fact. Thousands of officers, officials, and collaborators, not just low-level soldiers, but men at the very top of the hierarchy made it out of Europe. They used ratlins, organized escape routes that moved them from monasteries to ports, from sympathetic embassies to ships and U-boats. Forged passports were handed out, the Red Cross was exploited, and sympathetic governments looked the other way. The destination for many was South America. Argentina became a hub under President Juan Perón, who had been sympathetic to fascism since the 1930s. Chile also opened its doors. And soon, entire German communities began to flourish in the southern hemisphere. We're not talking about a few dozen fugitives hiding in the jungle. We're talking about thousands, if not tens of thousands, of high-ranking Nazis who rebuilt their lives in the open. Among them were men like Adolf Eichmann, the architect of the Holocaust, and Joseph Mengele, the doctor of death. These were not myths. Eichmann was eventually captured by Israeli agents in Argentina. Mengele lived for decades, practicing medicine in South America until he died swimming off the Brazilian coast. If men like this made it out, why should we assume Hitler couldn't have? The deeper we dug, the more extraordinary the evidence became. I visited towns in Argentina where, even in 2017, the language of the street was German, not Spanish. I walked into parlors that looked as if they had been lifted straight from Bavaria, deer heads mounted on the wall. Heavy European furniture, tiled floors, and heirlooms passed down like relics. I saw families open chests with white gloves, showing medals from the SS, uniforms, and personal artifacts carried across the ocean. They treated them as treasures. These weren't distant legends. These were the living descendants of men who fought under Hitler, men who had fled across the sea and rebuilt their lives in South America. And disturbingly, in many cases, the grandchildren were more fanatical about their heritage than their grandparents had been. Cut off from the world, they clung to identity as if it were religion, sometimes sliding into extremism. Some of them even traveled to the United States, becoming leaders in white supremacist movements before ending up in prison. The roots of their ideology trace straight back to enclaves in Argentina and Chile. In Chile, there was a place called Colonia Dignidad, founded by Nazi fugitives. On the surface, it looked like a German village tucked into the mountains. In reality, it was a torture camp. The men who built it held enormous influence with South American dictators, and for decades they operated with near impunity. Joseph Mengele himself was tied to it, practicing medicine, performing illegal abortions, continuing his work far from the eyes of justice. It is one of the darkest places I have ever studied, a reminder that the evil of the Nazi regime did not simply vanish in 1945. It metastasized and spread across continents. So on Hunting Hitler, we applied real man-hunting tradecraft. We brought in special forces operators, intelligence officers, even a CIA targeter who had helped locate Zarqawi in Iraq. We asked, how would we find Hitler today? The answer was clear. You don't chase the man, you chase the network. You follow the bodyguards, the financiers, the doctors, the couriers. You trace the routes they used, the safe houses they stayed in, the way money moved, the way protection was offered. That's how we caught terrorists in the modern era. And that's how we began to reconstruct the possibilities of 1945. And when we followed those lines, the picture that emerged was not of a closed case, but of an open field of possibilities. Eichmann lived freely until captured. Mengele practiced medicine. Otto Skorzeny, one of Hitler's commandos, worked across South America for decades, even collaborating with Western intelligence in the fight against communism. The Cold War had reshuffled priorities, and suddenly the Nazis were not the enemy to chase anymore. The enemy was Moscow, communism, and in that rush, many files were closed, many trails abandoned, and many men walked free. This shift was deliberate. The Nuremberg trials provided justice, yes, but they also served as a symbolic closing of the chapter. Once the Nazi threat was declared finished, the West could pivot to the new threat. Communism was now the existential danger. Resources, manpower, and money all had to turn eastward. The Iron Curtain was descending, Berlin was divided, Korea was boiling, and soon the Cold War was in full swing. In that climate, the desire to keep pursuing every Nazi fugitive dwindled. The story was closed, officially, because it had to be. The world needed to move on, and some men benefited from that urgency. And of course there was science. America had the bomb but needed rockets. We needed delivery systems. We wanted to get to space, to the moon. The Russians wanted the same. And both sides knew where the expertise lived. It lived in German laboratories. It lived with engineers who had built the V-2 rockets. It lived with men like Wernher von Braun. Operation Paperclip brought many of those men to the United States. Von Braun became a hero of NASA. But if you talk to survivors, if you look at what he did during the war, the story is darker. Jews who worked in his rocket factories tell of prisoners hanged as motivation for the others. The Simon Wiesenthal Center has said plainly that if von Braun were alive today, he would be tried for crimes against humanity. He was not just a scientist swept along by history. He was a Nazi. He wore the uniform. He oversaw the factories. His rockets killed Jews, and yet in the rush of the Cold War, his past was forgiven because his skills were too valuable to waste. That was the logic. We needed him. The Russians would have taken him if we didn't, and so he built the rockets that carried us to the stars. His crimes sealed away beneath the triumph of technology. That stain is real. That compromise was made, and it tells you everything about how priorities shifted in those years. So, what about Hitler himself? Were there eyewitnesses in South America? Yes, there were. Some claim to see him disembark from boats escorted by guards. Some claim to see him meet with local leaders. Others describe seeing convoys of cars waiting on beaches. On their own, any one of these stories might be dismissed as fantasy. But when they come from families who suddenly gained wealth in the late 1940s, who appeared from nowhere with money, passports, and power, the weight changes. Some of them had no reason to lie. Some of them had everything to lose by admitting the truth. But people love to be connected to history. In a quiet fishing village, being the man who saw Hitler step off a boat gives you importance. And that's the challenge, separating genuine sightings from the human hunger to be part of something bigger. Submarines don't just beach themselves on the sand, as some witnesses claimed. That's not how it works. But then again, not all of the accounts can be brushed aside so easily. We even tried to pursue DNA. Could the skull the Russians had actually belonged to Eva Braun? Could we confirm it through her descendants? We tracked them down. They refused. They wanted nothing to do with it. We explored the possibility of genealogical databases, services like 23andMe, to triangulate, but the family refused to consent. They wanted the past buried, and in their position maybe I'd feel the same. Still, it left a door closed, a question unanswered. And that is what hunting Hitler was really about. Not myth, not fantasy, but the refusal to accept neat answers where no proof exists. After 3 years of study, of walking the streets of German towns in Argentina, of handling documents stamped with Hoover's signature, of talking to witnesses and following networks, I can say this with certainty: the way history is written is wrong. The idea that we have the body, that the story is finished, that it is beyond dispute is not true. The skull wasn't Hitler's. The forensic record is chaos. The FBI spent years and millions of dollars searching. The Rotlins were real. The South American communities still exist. Powerful Nazis escaped. That much is beyond question. So when I was asked if I had to bet $1 million, would I put it on the bunker or on an escape? I answered honestly. I can't say with absolute proof where Hitler died, but I can say the official story doesn't hold. If I had to put my money down, I wouldn't bet on the bunker. I'd bet on the escape, because the evidence we've seen, the documents we've handled, the people we've spoken to, all point toward a world far murkier than the story we've been told. It doesn't mean Hitler rebuilt an empire. It doesn't mean he lived in glory. It means the truth is more complicated, more disturbing, and less final than we've wanted to believe. And that's the part that chills me. Because if we are willing to close the book without proof, just to make ourselves feel safe, then history becomes not fact, but comfort. And the truth slips away, hiding in the shadows, waiting to be told.
That is the story as I lived it, the files I studied, the places I walked, the people I met. You can choose to believe the neat version if you want, but I've seen too much to think it's over. The book was never really closed, the trail is still there, and the truth is still waiting. In episode 1339, musician Everlast shared a late-night discovery that shook his sense of reality. A boy genius, a theory about CERN, and a claim that in 2008 our universe may have ended. What followed was a dive into the Mandela effect, parallel dimensions, and the terrifying possibility that every night we wake in a different world than the one we left.
I've always had this thought in the back of my head that one day technology would get so advanced people wouldn't just settle for what they were. Born with, they'd start upgrading themselves like characters in a movie. Imagine artificial hands, not clunky robotic claws, but something sleek, bulletproof, self-healing, maybe made from spider silk hybrid skin that could repair itself. They're already working on materials like that. I've read about it. Skin that could resist bullets, that could heal on its own. And I keep thinking, once that exists, people are going to want it. People will choose it over their natural hands. It sounds like science fiction, but it's not far away, and when it arrives, it will change what it even means to be human. That thought alone is wild enough, but it was nothing compared to where my mind went one night. I was smoking, drifting through the internet, falling down the kind of YouTube wormhole where one video leads to another until you don't even remember how you got there. And I landed on this video. I don't even know if it was YouTube or somewhere else, but it was about this kid. Maybe 12 years old, supposedly the smartest kid in the world. The title stopped me cold. The world's smartest kid thinks CERN destroyed the universe in 2008. And I thought, what the hell does that even mean? So I clicked on the play. For 20 minutes, this kid just talked, and he talked in a way that made you sit up and pay attention. His dad, or maybe an uncle, someone close to him, was filming, and the boy was laying out these theories that seemed impossible for someone his age. He started with the basics: infinite parallel universes, reality stacked like pages in a book, each slightly different, each just a shift away from the other. And then he said something that twisted my brain in knots. When CERN, the European Particle Physics Lab, ran those collider experiments back in 2008, he believed they had caused a chain reaction that ended our universe. Not in some flashy explosion, but in a quiet, imperceptible collapse. At the same time, he said, they created an atom that weighed too much. And that tiny weight was enough to tip reality itself. That single atom dragged us sideways into a parallel universe, not the same one we came from, but one so close it looked almost identical. I sat there stunned. Because it wasn't just what he said, it was how he said it. Calm, logical, like he'd done the math. By the time the video ended, I was looking at the world around me differently. And here's the thing that really freaked me out. For months afterwards, everything I saw seemed to point to the same idea. News anchors offhandedly saying, I don't even know what universe I'm in anymore. Movies like Into the Spider-Verse suddenly explode in popularity. Shows, articles, casual conversations, everywhere I turned, it was multiverse this, parallel reality that. I couldn't escape it. It felt like the universe itself was confirming the kid's story, and then came the Mandela effect. People online claiming to remember history differently, like Nelson Mandela dying in prison when in fact he lived and became president. Others swearing that logos, book titles, or famous lines were once different. Some of it was silly, sure, but when you look at it through the lens of parallel universes, it starts to feel like echoes bleeding through from a world we used to inhabit. Maybe we really did shift sideways in 2008. Maybe that's why nothing feels quite the same. I know how it sounds crazy, but once that thought takes root, you start noticing things you can't unsee. And then the algorithm does its work. One video leads to another. One theory leads to 10 more. Pretty soon, you're surrounded by voices all whispering the same thing. The world isn't what you think it is. What if it's true? What if every night, when we fall asleep, we drift from one version of reality into another? What if we wake up each morning, not in the same world we left, but in one just a little different? We assume continuity because we remember yesterday, but memory is fragile, foggy, stitched together by a brain that dreams of impossible things while we're unconscious. Who's to say those dreams aren't fragments of other universes, half remembered when we open our eyes? Think about it. Every decision you make branches reality. Every path you don't take becomes a world that still exists somewhere. Maybe you just slide onto one of those paths every time you close your eyes. That would explain why things feel off sometimes, why memories clash, why you sense that something is wrong but can't put your finger on it. And then there's the simulation theory. What if we're not shifting universes at all, but logging into a new program every morning, like players in a cosmic video game? Maybe in the real universe, the one outside this one, life is perfect. Too perfect. So boring that beings choose to plug into this chaos for the thrill of it. Maybe we come here to suffer, to struggle, to love, and to hate, because without the contrast we'd never understand either. The only way to appreciate peace is to know war. The only way to value joy is to taste sorrow. So we enter the simulation, live these broken lives, and then forget it all when we wake up again. That's why everything feels off. That's why things get stranger and stranger. It's the ride we signed up for. Maybe the universe didn't collapse in 2008, maybe we did. Maybe we asked for this dot, and then you look at the world, the fires in the Amazon, the glaciers melting, the arguments about climate change, the way truth itself seems fractured, and you realize how fragile reality feels now. Truth doesn't even exist in one piece anymore. For every fact, there's a counterfact. For every headline, a rebuttal. It's like reality itself is arguing with itself, as if different universes are colliding right in front of us. We live in a time when you can counter any argument with something you read online, but none of it guarantees truth. The internet has made truth slippery and bendable. People copy and paste nonsense on social media, claim it protects them, and thousands believe it. Even powerful people with jobs guarding nuclear weapons, fall for it. If our leaders can't tell what's real, what hope do the rest of us have? Sometimes it feels like we're in Bizarro World, a twisted mirror of the place we used to live. And maybe that kid in the video was right. Maybe CERN tipped us into this one. Maybe you'll hear this and laugh, but later, when you're alone, when you're scrolling and another piece of the puzzle pops up, you'll remember this story. And you'll wonder, because once the idea takes root, it's hard to let go. What if every day, with every choice, every sleep, every dream, we slide into a new world just a little different than the last? What if we're drifting endlessly through parallel universes, thinking we're standing still? What if this isn't even the real one?
That's the thought that's been haunting me ever since. Maybe we're in the wrong universe, maybe we're in the right one, or maybe there's no such thing as right at all. All I know is this: once you open your mind to the possibility of infinite worlds, you can never look at this one the same way again. In episode 1821, comedians Bert Kreischer and Tony Hinchcliffe wandered into a question that has haunted science and storytellers alike. Time, they agreed, is stranger than it seems. Theories stacked like dominoes. Once one falls, everything else can topple. What followed was a long, strange map of paradox, possibility, and a future that rewrites the past.
I remember walking out of the theater with that movie still in my head. The way it folded worlds into one another until the edges blurred and you couldn't tell which life belonged to who. The film lodged in me because it took the multiverse from abstract thought experiment and made it feel like kitchen table reality, like a skill you could learn, switch into, and use. That idea hooked into something else I'd been chewing on for a long time. The old Terence McKenna thought about time machines and how a single invention could rip a hole in linear history. McKenna said that once someone builds a time machine, all time stops being a single thread and becomes a place anyone can walk into. From the moment of invention forward, anyone could travel back to that invention and then out to any moment thereafter. Suddenly, the future and the past coexist, everything everywhere all at once. Ownership vanishes. Intellectual property evaporates. The notion of first collapses, and with it the whole scaffolding of how civilization organizes itself. You can picture a world where, in the middle of a conversation, someone rewinds and changes the ending, where a lover replays an argument until it resolves the way they wish, where comedians pull facts from any era to land the perfect line. The consequences are beautiful and terrifying. Instant resurrection of idea and artifact, immediate access to godlike knowledge, and at the same time, the erasure of the meaning of achievement. How does a culture honor creativity if the future can freely give its inventions to the past? That abstract fear led us to people who have tried to make the math breathe. There's Ronald Mallet, a man who turned grief into physics and spent decades building theoretical models of time travel after losing his father. His work reads like a comic book origin story, a life propelled into obsession and invention. Mallet built devices to illustrate principles that, if scaled, would require energy beyond anything we wield now. Machines that, In concept, might let information travel along closed loops of time. Then there are the giants of theory, people like Kurt Gödel, who in the 20th century found solutions in Einstein's equations for spacetimes that permit closed time like curves, mathematical paths that loop back on themselves. Those solutions say there is no single linear ordering of moments, only a geometry of time where tomorrow and yesterday fold together. The equations are elegant and intimidating, and when you try to let them sit in your mind, they create an almost physical vertigo. Infinity presses close. The more seriously you take it, the more the everyday certainty of before and after dissolves. From thought experiments and equations, we move to the social consequences. If time travel becomes a tool, it becomes infrastructure. Once accessible, it changes politics, markets, and meaning itself. If any invention can be plucked from a future and instantiated in the past, patents become nonsense. Wealth can be introduced retroactively, and the idea of being a first mover vanishes. Imagine a world where the person who receives the right secret at the right time builds the empire, then watches a future visitor come back and distribute that secret widely. The future becomes a library that anyone can borrow from, and with that library comes inequality on a scale hard to imagine. At the same time, the possibility of immortality opens. If you can travel forward to a godlike era and bring its benefits back, death looks different. Technology has become not a forward march, but a pool anyone can draw from. The ethics of such power would be the defining politics of any society that mastered temporal transit. Our conversation drifted, as conversations do, into everyday strangeness. The Mandela effect slipped into the frame. That odd internet chorus of shared misremembering, logos shifted, lines changed, people remembered events differently. From a multiverse angle, it reads like small scars where realities almost stitched together badly, like echoes of the life you used to live. Then there was the simulation idea, the cousin of the theory that humbles you into thinking everything might be artifice. Perhaps we are the bored descendants of a perfect universe choosing to plug into a messy one for the sake of contrast. To feel and to err, because without pain, there is no appreciation of joy. Under that model, time travel is not merely physical, but experiential. We log into different programs, live a life, and log out. The moral of that story is oddly consoling. Suffering becomes intentional, a lesson plan rather than chaos. It is also destabilizing because it robs the world of the sense of raw, unmediated fact. All of these speculations fold together with our tools. Virtual reality stands on the edge of allowing reconstructions so convincing they feel like time travel without moving an atom. Imagine pouring every scrap of historical data into a simulation, stitching together a sensory world that lets you walk among the pyramid builders or stand on a Victorian street. Even if it's guesswork, the visual and auditory experience could be persuasive enough to change the way we treat the past. Today's models would be simulation interpretations, not exact reproductions, but the line will blur. Memory and history will compete with immersion. The difference between seeing and living will narrow until the two are indistinguishable for most observers. Beneath all the theory and gadget talk, there's a human question about how to live when the ground shifts. If every choice spawns another reality, how do you find moral weight in anything? If every life branches into infinite variations, how do you hold anyone accountable? The remedy we stumbled toward was simpler than physics. Pay attention to how you distribute your energy. Live as well as you can with what's in front of you. That advice survives whether time is an unbending river, a topology of loops, or a library anyone can raid. Small, consistent acts matter. Presence matters. If time travel ever arrives, the only sane plan for most people is to cultivate integrity. Because in a cosmos where reality multiples, the practice of goodness makes a kind of anchor. When math turns into myth and the myth into policy, our world will look different. We will have to invent manners of stewardship for temporal knowledge, laws to govern the flow of inventions across eras, and ethical schools to decide whether to bring futures into the past. Some will weaponize time. Some will try to heal. Some will simply be lost in the vertigo of infinite possibility. That's the shape of the risk and the wonder, A technology that liberates could also nullify the very reasons we become human. Walking out of that conversation with Tony, I felt the familiar thrill comedians get when a ridiculous idea lands into something dangerous and real. We braided jokes into physics, and in the cracks the terror showed through. The panic of being small inside an infinite frame, the dizzying sense of electrons and equations rearranging everything you thought you owned. Infinity is beautiful and terrifying, and the day we learn to walk through time will be the day our notions of property, of art, of love, and of consequence all get rewritten. Until that morning, the best we can do is wonder. Read the equations, watch the films, and try to live honestly in the world we have now.
In episode 1821, the joke about time folded into a serious question. What happens when invention destroys linear history? The answer is still far away, but the thought alone changes how we see every moment. If time can be bent, we are all already standing in the ripple. In episode 1852, Sam Tripoli walked us into a corner of history most people never mention. A fleet to Antarctica, a mission that returned with questions the official record won't answer. What Sam described was not simple exploration. It was a rumor of hidden bases, strange craft, and deals made in the dark.
Operation High Jump began on paper as a bold naval expedition to the southernmost edge of the world. Admiral Richard Byrd took ships, planes, and thousands of men to test gear, map ice, and train sailors for polar conditions. But the way the story threads through whispered journals and fractured accounts gives it a different shape. An urgent mission sent because someone in Washington believed something was happening in Antarctica that required explanation. They didn't send a research team. They sent a fleet. The scale and speed of that response read less like curiosity and more like containment. World War II had just ended. Nations were still sorting winners from losers, and whispers persisted that the Reich had not simply capitulated and vanished. The rumor goes that some of the most advanced elements of Nazi engineering were spirited south and escaped to a place where the map thins and nations keep their distance. New Schwabenland, a name the old maps peck at with Germanic script, is one of those places that catches a conspiracy mind, a frozen stretch that allegedly hid bases, research stations, and things that didn't belong to conventional warfare. The accounts tied to Byrd are the kind of thing that hits your attention. He spoke later, in interviews and journals, about aerial phenomena that moved in ways no known craft could. He warned of an opponent who could traverse the globe with speed that made everything else obsolete, language that reads like an admiral witnessing technologies far beyond his Navy's inventory. That warning sits like an ember beneath the official logs. Men returned with broken ships, strange reports, and a mission that ended sooner than planned. Official explanations point to ice, accidents, the brutal conditions of the pole. But when you line those mundane reasons up against the scale of the fleet and Byrd's odd comments, the edges of the ordinary begin to blur. There are darker threads that people pull on when they talk about high jump. Some voices tie it to Nazi occult obsession, the regime's flirtation with secret knowledge and artifacts. The idea that Hitler's circle didn't only pursue tanks and rockets but a metaphysical edge. Others point to industrial collaborators and corporate histories, the uncomfortable. Books that remind us of geopolitical alliances with companies that did business with the Reich. From that tangle emerges a tale that includes more than just men. It suggests that Germany's engineers were extraordinarily advanced, that some firms provided the machinery and accounting that made evil efficient, and that the remnants of that apparatus could have been repurposed somewhere remote and icy. Then there's the alien angle, the part of the story that pushes most listeners back into disbelief. It goes like this. Nazi scientists, desperate in the closing days of the war, made contact with something not human. In that version, the Reich traded technologies or pacts with other intelligences, a bargain that reshaped their capabilities and perhaps their escape routes. Sam's telling leaned into that mythology, Nazis meeting with non-human craft, demonstrating new aerial forms, forging arrangements in hidden places. That's the part of the tale that has everything to lose in translation between rumor and record. Yet it's also the part that explains why a government might send a naval armada rather than a mapping team. If your adversary has craft that can traverse pole to pole, then exploration becomes a mission of confrontation. We move from the high level to the granular when we talk about new Schwabenland and the communities of engineers and sympathizers who allegedly kept the flame alive after the war. In immigrant towns across continents, traces remain: language, customs, heirlooms, people who carry memories that don't line up with sanitized histories. You walk into a room and the decor, the language, the reverence for objects looks less like natural assimilation and more like a transplanted culture that never quite let go. That scene is eerie enough in a Buenos Aires parlor or a mountain settlement in Chile, and it becomes even more suggestive when you find crossovers, records of men who vanished from Europe, then reappeared in the southern hemisphere with new names and improbable wealth. The Ratlins were not a myth. They were a logistics problem solved by paper, sympathy, and money. These networks produced enclaves where, by some accounts, the grandchildren of former Nazis still hold on to a memory for their ancestors that looks suspiciously like reverence. Colonia, Dignidad in Chile is one of the chapters that refuses to fade. A compound that outwardly resembled a German settlement, but inwardly it functioned as a place of control and terror, a sanctuary for those who needed protection from prosecution and a staging ground for influence. Allegations about abuse, collaboration, and impunity hang heavy over its history. When people talk about Mengele and others using South America as a refuge, these are the places they mean: shadowed pockets on the map where accountability struggled to reach. Those places make the idea of an Antarctic refuge feel less fantastical. If men could hide and build enclaves under friendly regimes on the continent's warmer edges, what might have been hidden under the ice looks more plausible. If only because secrecy had proven workable already. Our modern conversation about Operation High Jump also drifts into the cultural, into the way nations guard their secrets today. Antarctica is not the wild, ungoverned white sheet we imagine. It sits under treaties and inspections. Nations watch for movement. And yet, treaties don't erase curiosity. Where there is secrecy, imagination fills the gaps. People build narratives for the things they cannot see. Some narratives are useful. Others are dangerous. The more the official account shows its scenes, the more. Birds' warnings ring odd next to a quick retreat. The more room there is for the stories that demand ships return with more than meteorological data. The spiritual and conspiratorial angles twist this further. Some see High Jump as proof of deals with dark forces, a spiritual war where money and power are animated by something other than human greed. Others read it as a power grab, men using what they found for control and profit rather than for the good of humankind. The language varies, but the core worry is the same. What would people do with access to knowledge and power no one else could match? Would they hoard it, weaponize it, or would they use it to remake the world on their terms? Those are not idle questions if you accept the premise that technology can be secreted away in a place where ice masks activity and treaties. Obscure the record. When I listen to these stories, I don't pretend to have a single truth to hand. I do, however, see a pattern, an extraordinary mission, a hurried end. A few official statements that don't fully account for what men on the ground later swore they saw. One, see isolated communities that preserved memory, companies whose wartime contracts raise uncomfortable questions, and a continent that, because of its remoteness, will always be a theater for the imagination. Operation High Jump sits at the intersection of all that. It is an expedition that provokes more questions than it answers. And for listeners who love a good mystery, that is exactly the point. None of this proves aliens. And none of it definitively proves a Nazi fortress under the ice. What it does show is how history can harbor rooms behind locked doors, how new information, a journal, a declassified cable, an odd admiral's interview, can throw light into corners we assumed were settled. The story of High Jump is a reminder that sometimes the official version is only the shape of what someone wants you to see. Underneath, Messier currents run. And when you combine human ambition, wartime desperation, and the scale of a place like Antarctica, you get a story that will not die quietly.
In episode 1852, the story of Operation High Jump came alive as more than an expedition. It became a question the ice keeps asking. Were they hunting weather or hunting something else? The ships sailed back, the files closed, and the southern horizon kept its silence. But the rumors remain, and the ice remembers. In episode 2219, Joe Rogan sat across from Donald Trump and pushed at doors most presidents leave closed. The Kennedy files, the UFO briefings, promises of disclosure, and then the kinds of pauses that tell you some truths are heavier than paper. What follows is Trump's account, told straight without the theater, of what he saw, why he hesitated, and what kept those doors half shut.
When I talk about the JFK files, I'm talking about old things that people have argued over for decades. Files that every president eventually encounters in some form. Documents that historians, journalists, and a lot of Americans have wanted to see for a long time. I'll be honest, I opened some of them, and when you first hear the question, why not open them all? It sounds obvious that the truth should be released. I thought so too. But once you get into it, people you respect, people with years of service and judgment, start calling you and telling you to hold back. Pompeo called me. Nice people, smart people, reasonable people. They said, "Sir, we'd rather you not." That was a heavy ask and I took it seriously. I partially opened them, not everything, because there were living people involved. People who had worked for the government. People who would be affected by what was in those files. You generally don't want to throw living people under the bus without cause. There could also be national security reasons, things I don't even have to know. I found myself in that space, the instinct to be transparent versus the weight of consequences others warned me about. I told people I'd open enough that it would be a cleansing, that we'd do it early in the term. I wanted to be open. I said I would do it almost immediately upon entering office. But the reality is more complicated than a tweet. I listened to the counsel of very talented people who asked me to delay certain releases. And while I felt the public had a right to know, I also felt the responsibilities of the office, that sometimes the path to truth must be balanced against the harm that truth could do to individuals, or to ongoing security considerations. So I left some things closed for a time. I think in the end that opening them is the right move, but it's not as simple as flipping a switch. The files on Martin Luther King and the documents tied to Dallas sit in similar tension. History needs light. But we also have living people and unresolved threads to consider. Then there's the other thing everyone wants to push on, the sightings, the pilots, the footage. I've talked to pilots, very solid people, great pilots, guys like Commander David Fravor, men with records and credibility, and they told me what they saw. I brought some of them in. I had them in front of me. I watched videos that were compelling, radar evidence, visual footage, 2 jets seeing the same thing. Objects that went from 50,000 feet to the sea level in a blink. Movements that a human pilot couldn't survive. The G-forces alone would turn you into jelly. They saw a disturbance in the water, something hovering, footage of it, and instruments that picked it up. These are professionals, not conspiracy folks. When pilots like that tell you something, you listen. I've talked to several of them. They're solid, they're credible, and they all said, "Sir, there's something there that makes you pay attention." It's not a parlor trick. It's not a hoax they all agreed on. Their witness accounts aligned with recordings and radar. Do I believe we're alone in the universe? There's no reason to assume we are. The cosmos is big. We've sent probes to Mars, we've studied it, and while we haven't found bacterial life there, the history of planets suggests possibilities. Maybe there was life on Mars long ago. Maybe there are forms of life we don't recognize. So, when military pilots come forward with consistent reports of extraordinary phenomena, it's worth treating seriously. At the same time, there are other possibilities that complicate the picture. Advanced technology developed by state actors. Stealth platforms, even drones with capabilities we don't fully understand. We've had incidents where a balloon or a drone in the sky caused a national reaction. People wondered whether it was a foreign device or something else. You have to sort through those options carefully. I interview people, I test their credibility, I think about the implications. I'm not a wild believer in conspiracies. But I don't dismiss solid professional testimony out of hand. The pilots I talked to weren't fringe characters. They weren't looking for attention. They were accomplished, decorated officers who said they saw something moving in ways that defy known propulsion and leave no heat signature. No obvious method of lift or thrust. That's extraordinary. You can't explain it away casually. And when you stack that together with footage and radar, you get an intelligence question that the Pentagon and the services take very seriously. It's something you can't laugh off. If you have technology in the sky that can outrun our fastest jets and show no signature, you have to know what it is and who controls it. You also have to think about how disclosure would land with the public. If the president stands up and says there are things in our airspace that are not of our making, what happens? Panic? Skepticism? Dismissal? A mix of everything. Part of my hesitation around some releases, not all, came from the council. I received about the potential consequences of revealing certain names, certain operations or material that would implicate living people. There are legal and ethical roads you must tread. There are very talented people who work long and hard to protect secrets for reasons I won't always fully see from the outside. So you balance transparency with prudence. I tried to do that. I opened a lot and I left a lot for another day because people asked me to. I listened to people I trusted, but when it comes to the phenomenon itself, the pattern of testimony is worth taking seriously. The commander's account off the coast of San Diego in 2004 is compelling something. Observed that moved at extraordinary speeds and then dove into the water, leaving traces they could record. That's not trivial. And whether it's foreign tech, a natural phenomenon we don't yet understand, or something else entirely, the government owes the American people rigorous investigation and honest reporting. It's part of the duty of command to know what's in your skies and in your waters, and to be candid about the scope of the unknown while protecting legitimate national security concerns. That's the line I walked. Push for openness, but listen to experienced people who warned me about harms from careless revelation. People wanted me to be bold and to throw everything wide open, and I tried to be as open as I could while also being mindful of the consequences that real disclosure can have in real time.
I opened parts of the files and heard things that made me pause. I talked to pilots whose testimony demands respect. The balance between truth and harm is ugly and impossible sometimes, and until the public can see everything without risking people or security, the files will keep being a difficult gift. That tension between what the American people deserve to know and what responsibility requires is the hardest part of running things at the top. In episode 2317, Cody Tucker and Joe Rogan dug into one of the oldest and strangest questions in human history, giants. From biblical tales of Goliath to reports buried in archives, the idea of an ancient race has refused to vanish. Were they myth? Were they just unusually large men? Or were they something more, a branch of humanity erased by time and perhaps by intention?
When you start with giants, people laugh. They imagine fairy tales, exaggerated campfire stories, or wrestlers blown out of proportion. But the deeper you dig, the harder it is to shake the persistence of these stories. Cultures oceans apart. Tell tales of people so tall they towered above the average man. The Bible speaks of the Nephilim. Norse sagas describe frost giants. Native American oral histories record tribes who fought or traded with beings much larger than themselves. If it was only one culture, you could dismiss it as myth. But when it's everywhere, the question sharpens. What are all these stories pointing to? Part of the fascination lies in what archaeology sometimes uncovers. Farmers in the 1800s and early 1900s claimed to dig up bones far larger than normal. Local papers ran stories of skeletons measuring 8, 9, sometimes 10 feet. Most of those reports vanished into obscurity, some dismissed as hoaxes, others supposedly sent to institutions like the Smithsonian and then never seen again. That's where the conspiracy grows. If a bone that large existed, if a skeleton truly challenged our sense of human limits, would the institutions we trust announce it? Or would they hide it to protect the narrative of evolution, of history, of what we think we know about ourselves? The practical questions haunt the idea. If giants once lived, why aren't they here now? Some say they died off in cataclysms, like the Younger Dryas impact theory, when a comet or fragment struck Earth around 12,000 years ago, throwing the planet into chaos and starving countless species. If you're that large, if you need massive amounts of food just to survive, the sudden loss of resources could wipe you out quickly. Others say the giants weren't recent at all, that they belonged to a deep past, another branch of humanity, like the Denisovans or the Hobbit people discovered in Indonesia. Evolution doesn't move in a straight line. New branches appear all the time in the fossil record, and if we've only just found evidence of small-bodied humans, why not the opposite? Skeptics counter that what people call giants may have simply been very large men. Vikings, for example, often stood far taller than the average European, their descendants still dominating strongman competitions today. Think of Hafthor Bjornsson, the mountain from Game of Thrones, standing at nearly 7 feet, over 400 pounds of muscle. Imagine encountering a whole community of men like him when the average soldier weighed 120 pounds and stood barely 5'4". That would feel like meeting giants. But then there are outliers that strain belief even in modern times, men over 7, and a half-feet tall recorded in military history, Civil War soldiers whose height dwarfed their regiments. These examples show that the genetic potential exists, hidden in the human blueprint. So maybe what ancient people called giants were simply the extreme edge of that potential, nourished, clustered, and exaggerated into myth. And yet, the mystery lingers. Every so often, a discovery surfaces that feels like a piece of the puzzle. In China, archaeologists uncovered remains 4,000 years old, their owner standing at least 6'4", massive for that era when the average man was barely 5 feet tall. Drill holes in the skull suggested rituals or practices we don't fully understand. To his people, that man would have been a towering Goliath. If one existed, why not more? The fear and the thrill of the conspiracy comes from imagining. What would happen if someone stumbled across undeniable proof today? Imagine you're out in West Texas, digging with friends. When you pull a femur from the dirt that's the length of your arm, followed by a foot the size of your torso, what do? Call a university? Bring in experts? If the conspiracy theories are right, the discovery would never see daylight. The bones would be cataloged, boxed, and locked away. Or worse, you'd be silenced. Researchers who chase these stories often warn that anyone who finds proof risks being discredited or destroyed. The idea that institutions could erase a truth to preserve their version of history is the fire that keeps the giant conspiracy alive. Because if giants were real, it would rewrite everything. It would mean our species was not alone even in its recent history. It would mean the Bible's Goliath, the sagas of frost giants, the stories of enormous men striding the earth weren't just allegories, they were memories. And if those memories are true, then what else have we buried? What other bones lie beneath our feet, waiting for someone bold or lucky enough to find them?
In episode 2317, Cody Tucker and Joe Rogan didn't prove the giants were real, but they showed why the stories endure. Myths don't survive for millennia without a reason. Whether it was exaggeration, evolution, or something humanity isn't ready to admit, the shadow of giants still walks behind us, and the earth may yet hold their bones.